Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1939, on the 10th of December, the first convoy of Canadian troops departs for England, and the League of Nations calls for the Soviet Union to end hostilities. On the 13th of December, the Battle of the River Plate takes place off the coast of Argentina and Uruguay. In 1940, on the 9th of December, Operation Compass begins in North Africa. On the 11th of December, the Battle of Sidi Barrani ends in Allied victory. On the 12th of December, the Sheffield Blitz begins. Hungary and Yugoslavia sign an eternal friendship treaty, and on the 13th of December, Hitler issues Directive 20 for the German invasion of Greece. In 1941, on the 8th of December, Hitler cancels offensive operations on the Eastern Front. Roosevelt makes the infamy speech to Congress. Japan bombs Singapore and occupies the Shanghai International Settlement. The UK declares war on Japan. Japan invades Thailand. The Malayan, Philippine and Dutch East Indies campaigns and the battles of Guam, Wake Island and Hong Kong begin. On the 9th of December, China formally declares war on Japan, Germany and Italy. On the 10th of December, the Prince of Wales and Repulse are sunk by the Japanese. The Battle of Guam ends in Japanese victory. Germany and Italy declare war on the US. Germany and Italy sign a new pact barring them from making separate peace. Congress declares war on Germany and Italy, and in British Malaya, the Battle of Jitra begins. On 12th of December 1941, Hitler says the Jewish race is to be annihilated, and the Japanese invade Legazpi in southern Luzon. On the 13th of December, the Battle of Cape Bon takes place off Tunisia, and the Battle of Jitra in British Malaya ends in Japanese victory. In 1942, on the 8th of December, German forces occupy Bizerte in Tunisia. On the 9th of December, the Australians capture Gurna in New Guinea. On the 11th of December, the Battle of El Agheila begins in Libya, and Italian manned torpedoes and frogmen raid Algiers. On the 12th of December, begin Operation Winter Storm to break the Soviet encirclement of Stalingrad, and the Soviets begin Operation Little Saturn. On the 13th of December, Rommel withdraws from El Agheila. In 1943, on the 8th of December, the Battle of San Pietro Infine in Italy begins. On the 10th of December, the 8th Army crosses the Moro River on the Adriatic coast, and the Mediterranean Allied Air Force is created under Ira Eker. In 1944, on the 11th of December, the 8th Army in Italy crosses the Limone River. On the 12th of December, the US 3rd Army captures a V rocket factory at Wittering in eastern France, and Harold Alexander is promoted to Field Marshal and made Supreme Commander of Allied Force Headquarters in the Mediterranean. On the 13th of December, the Battle of Metz ends in American victory. The Battle of Kestenich begins, and the Battle of Mindoro begins in the central Philippines. In 1945, on the 9th of December, George Patton suffers a broken neck in a car accident in Germany. Well, those are the events in 1939 to 45, basically the second week of December, and we're going to be discussing those in some detail. But first of all, I want to bring in the co-host. It's Joe Quinn. Yeah, hello, Joe.
Hello, Eddie. How are you doing?
Well, you're in Berlin, aren't you, Joe? You're
That's
here.
correct.
You're there for pleasure and for a bit of work. Tell us a little about it.
Yes, well, I can certainly discuss this in a little bit more detail in next week's episode with the aid of photographs. But what I can tell you is that my time in Berlin has one that's given me much pause, thought, and I've been reflecting quite a lot on. Just to say, basically, I'm in a basically a corridor area, so you might hear a bit of noise in the background. This is basically a hotel just around the corner from Checkpoint Charlie, which exists only in the form of basically a wooden, essentially checkpoint hut, one of many that were right throughout the city, but this was the only part of basically the frontier along the Berlin Wall where essentially you could travel into East Berlin. It was the only recognized area where the Soviets and also the East Germans would allow transit from the west to the east. So up until about 30 something years ago, this particular area was essentially divided by a concrete wall, which only partially exists in certain areas. So this was a very much divided city up until very recent history. And for more on this, I'd recommend to our viewers to read Katja Hoyer's book Beyond the Wall, and also her the previous book, Blood and Iron, which basically discusses the long sort of 2 centuries of modern German history from unification right through into the 20th century. So she is a leading author on this, also a very well recognized Second World War author. But in terms of what I saw in Berlin, I went to 2 museums over the last 2 days. One is called the Topography of Terror Museum, which is very close. It's basically at the corner where Checkpoint Charlie is. And this is located on the site of the old SS headquarters, which used to stand on Prince Albrechtstrasse. And this was the site of horrific crimes, murders of Jews, murder and torture of Jews, communists, and so-called undesirables, which the German state under Nazi rule no longer wanted and wanted to deal with. And it's also from this building, from this SS headquarters, that a great deal of what we now know as the final solution was coordinated, and also the terror apparatus under the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, and other agencies of the SS, the SS Gestapo, was operated from this particular site. And you had all the leading figures of the SS, including Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, and various different figures of that kind, and Muller, and various different acolytes of the SS, basically within this particular orbit, all going in and out of this building. So the building no longer exists. It has been wiped from the face of the earth, but the some rubble and basically the foundation ruins remain. And when you go into the place, there is a sense, and I had a discussion with Ian Pegg, who also coincidentally was visiting Germany just in the last number of days, just around about the same time that I arrived. He was visiting the site of the Bergen-Belsen camp that also now no longer exists, but the sites of the mass graves from the Bergen-Belsen transit camp still lie within the ground and are marked, and there's a local interpretive center where you can basically go today to find out more about what took place there. So Ian was very much visibly, he posted 2 videos on his social media platform X, and basically was visibly very affected by what he saw. And this is feeding into the research that he's going to be doing on his book project about the Bergen-Belsen camp. And I won't go into too much details about our conversation, but all I would say is that both of us, in terms of our visits to basically him to Bergen-Belsen and my visit to the Topography of Terror Museum, which particularly affected me, as well as also my visit this morning to the Museum of the Murdered Jews of Europe, which is not too far away. It's just around the corner from the Brandenburg Gate and the Unter den Linden. These were locations, cultural heritage institutions in the heart of Berlin, which I would recommend for everybody to go and see. I would say that I felt a little bit lighter having gone to the the site of the Museum of the Murdered Jews of Europe, ironically, because one of the things I would say is that the way in which they tell the stories, they tell the personal stories of whole families from all over Europe, from countries all over Europe, who either perished in the Holocaust or survived the experience of the Holocaust very narrowly, but having lost a lot of their relatives. So these stories are humanized, and you're getting it very much from a familial point of view. In some ways, it conveys something of the horror of what took place, but in some ways, because of the way it's humanized, it makes it far more accessible in terms of understanding the depth of the crimes that took place and how individuals, not just basically statistics, as we say, tens of thousands and millions, but the actual ordinary individuals, how they were affected right across Europe by the crimes that the Nazis perpetrated. But I would have to say that the site of the Topography of Terror Museum, there was a great heaviness there, and it fed into a wider heaviness that I felt in the city. Everybody talks about what an amazing place it is to go to Berlin, but this is a city that I very much feel, and I've only been here 2 days, but it is a city very much deeply, deeply traumatized by the horror of what took place here over 80 years ago.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because I've been to Berlin. I used to go there on business, and I also thought, that's since 1990, obviously, and the extent to which we've been rebuilt, the modern, very modern city, everything works. The extraordinary reconstruction of the Reichstag with the museum there, and I suppose, I haven't been there more recently, but when I was there, I felt very positive. Berlin at this point, we're talking with the kind of high point of the European Union, with Germany at the centre of the European Union, looking very positively to the future. And I always struck with Berlin as a different kind of impression, because I come here with a United Kingdom-ish sensitivity, which is the historic connections between the United Kingdom and particularly, between Great Britain and Germany through, I can't help but refer to the Queen Victoria, her daughter, her eldest daughter married. He became the Kaiser before Kaiser Wilhelm, and he died prematurely. And the British hope that Germany would become a liberal constitutional democracy like Britain and have an elected parliament and a very liberal-minded. And that was the aspiration. That all went off the rails when her eldest daughter's husband died prematurely and was succeeded by Queen Victoria's grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm, who spoilt everything. But anyway, the different perspectives in Berlin, we perhaps could discuss this on another occasion. I'm going to move on to dates this week, and this is the big one. I'm going to start on this one. It was the last slide, because on the 9th of December 1945, General Patton was in a car crash, and he broke his neck. So his neck was broken, and he was dying slowly. And he said, when he was in hospital, he told his wife, he said, "A hell of a way for me to die." And he eventually died on the 21st of December. But today was the day when he had the car crash. Of course, people have conspiracy theories about it, but it looks like it was just a car crash. And he suffered his fatal injury. It took him 2 weeks to die. Now, he was born on the 11th of November, 1885. So he was born on Armistice Day, 1885. So he's a 19th century fella. And he was born in California. So California being a state that's well known for being liberal. But Patton came from a family of Confederates, and that lingered with him all through his life. Very sympathetic to the Southern cause. And he went to the Virginia Military Institute, which is the institute before he went to West Point. And that's him on the right, wearing the VMI uniform. So the VMI produced people like Stonewall Jackson. So very closely associated. He's very proudly associated with the Confederate cause, and that came through with some of his attitudes, which were pretty unacceptable in today's terms about ethnicities and religions. He was commissioned in 1909 into the cavalry. So he was a cavalryman. And he was also a superb athlete. So he competed in the 1912 Olympics for America in the modern pentathlon, which puts him into a different class of American generals. But his first real major experience of war was as a cavalryman in the expedition against Pancho Villa in Mexico in 1915. So he's riding horses as if he had been, in the Confederate cavalry of the Second World War. And that's what he was doing. But in the First World War, he was commander of the 1st Provisional Tank Brigade. And that's where he became acquainted with the effectiveness of armor. After the war, like everybody else, he was a professional soldier. He went nowhere, but at the start of the Second World War, he was promoted to Brigadier General in 1939. And in that period between 39 and 42, he emerged as the greatest advocate of combined arms operations, at least on the ground, using tanks. Very very aggressive commander, trained his people to the very limit of their physical capability, and he emerged. He was the commander of the he commanded the Western Task Force in Tunisia. And then, of course, he emerged as a combat commander in the 2nd Corps in Tunisia. And then in Sicily, he led the 7th Army and then the 3rd US Army in France, and finally in the 15th Army. So that's, let's show another slide. And that's his grave in Luxembourg. So he died, as you can see, he died on the 21st, and he's classified as General of the 3rd Army. So he's buried with other men from his army. So, Joe, any words about Patton?
Other than to say that he was actually a figure that I found very inspirational when I was coming up as a teenager. I mean, I was weaned onto Second World War content really beginning. I think I've told the story many times ad nauseum, how I went to see Saving Private Ryan with my grandfather, and I had, sort of previous interactions with Second World War history before that, and I started to get really, really interested. But it was that was the road to Damascus moment for me. And I never looked back. I think we all of us who have an interest in the Second World War, we all have our particular stories. But I do remember becoming interested in Patton, and came across obviously the film, which I found hard to take seriously at first. For a long time, I actually thought that this larger-than-life character was somewhat, he had somewhat a comical effect in terms of, his addresses to these troops with the American flag and some of the speeches that he gave. I have to say that I thought for a long time that with regard to his reputation, sort of as a kind of a brutal general, sort of very, not giving quarter to US soldiers who were suffering from combat fatigue, combat stress, the slapping incident in Sicily. I sort of, in my head, I just sort of pardoned it, because I thought to myself, well, this is arguably the most effective general really of the whole of the Western Allied forces, or one of them certainly. And definitely it was the case that the German military, the hierarchy, the high command of the Wehrmacht in the West certainly regarded him as such. And if you look at his performance in Normandy, when he's introduced, when basically they open up Third Army, when they basically activate Third Army, and they basically give him command of this new army that they've opened up, and essentially let him off the leash. I mean, he effectively, he runs into the West and then heads south and pulls a pincer move, and then essentially pulls off a masterstroke at the Battle of Mortain, and effectively seals the deal when it comes to the Falaise Gap. He basically, effectively, the Germans are encircled. He basically rolls up the entire German flank in terms of the German containment of the Allied pocket in Normandy. And he does that. He does that, like, he has air support and he has all these assets, but the bottom line is that the Allied air support, of which there is, there's ample resources been thrown his way, and but the fact of the matter is his mastery in the use of armored warfare in that campaign alone, as well as the fact that he takes his army out of the line during the Battle of the Ardennes, and they do a 90-degree turn, move out of the line, and basically advance into a new combat theater, effectively in the space of about 48 to 72 hours. And he says that he's going to do this, and that basically he has the plans in place. He's got everything. His staff have everything prepped, and he just literally does it once he gets the authorization. does something absolutely incredible, relieves the siege of Bastogne, and basically effectively starts driving the Germans back at the point that their offensive, the whole Ardennes offensive, begins to crumble and fail. I have to say that he was definitely one of the best Allied commanders, without doubt. But a very controversial legacy certainly is Confederate affiliations. Sort of would raise a few eyebrows. His attitudes towards African American soldiers and towards race relations in particular probably were, there's some debate over whether he was in fact actually a racist, or had a sort of a racist, shall we say, caste ideology, as would befit somebody who comes from a deeply embedded Southern Confederate culture. One of the things I would also just say is that he wasn't alone in this. I mean, there were other generals as well that did come from Confederate lineage. And one of them was none other than Simon Buckner, whose grandfather was a general during the American Civil War, and who was one of the first Confederate generals to surrender to General Grant in the Western Theater. So Simon Buckner, who was killed on Okinawa. He was the army commander, and he was killed. He was a very brave general and got too close to the front line. Was very much loved by his men. I mean, these were generals who were comparable in some ways in terms of their effect in their respective theaters. Patton in the European Theater of Operations and Buckner in the Pacific Theater of Operations, and they both, sort of were popular with their men. They were very effective ground and tactical commanders, and they were both remembered for dying before their time, really within their particular theaters of operation. Buckner dying effectively in combat, and Patton dying of this unfortunate accident. I'm not going to comment on the whole conspiracy theory, only to say that Patton had grave concerns about the future of post-war Europe and the division of Germany, and felt very strongly about it. And it is, of some note that at the time that the accident happened, leading up to his death, he had expressed deep misgivings about the Allied post-war plan, particularly with regard to the Soviets, and also with regard to what was happening in Germany. He profoundly disagreed with the Allies on this, and I guess that's one of the reasons why these conspiracy theories have been so well fueled up as they have been.
Anyway, obviously, people who are interested in Patton, the film, which is a Stanley Kubrick film, and George C. Scott played Patton and got an Oscar for it.
No, sorry to correct you. It's not Stanley Kubrick. It's Francis Ford Coppola.
Oh,
one of his first. Yeah. Francis
no.
Ford.
All right. Can I correct that? I'll take that out of the edit.
Yeah.
The film was a Francis Ford Coppola film, and very watchable. Very watchable. Anyway, let's move on to the first date, which is, I'm not going to dwell on this, which is the Battle of the River Plate. So this is 13th of December, so that's 1939. And this was a naval confrontation off the coast of Argentina and Uruguay, and it eventually led to the Graf Spee, a German battleship, finding refuge in the River Plate, and eventually was penned in by the Royal Navy and was scuttled. And there's a film about it. I'll come to that in a second. And after the battleship was scuttled, so the commander of the Graf Spee, that's Langsdorff, and he came to the funeral for crew members, and I think that's in Uruguay. And I think 3 days after this photograph was taken, he killed himself. So there you are. And that's the Battle of the River Plate. It's another film with Anthony Quayle, Peter Finch, John Gregson. It's quite watchable. Anyway, there you are. We like popular culture references. So in 1940, as we move on to the next year, we have Operation Compass. And I always like to have a picture of an Irishman in it. And there's Richard O'Connor out on the right. And this is he was the commander of the main attack force in Operation Compass. And you can see from the blue lines what was happening. The blue lines show the British Commonwealth Imperial forces driving into eastern Libya and inflicting serious defeats on the Italian forces. Of course, this precipitated a response in the Africa Corps, and Rommel came. So, Joe, Any comments about the man on the right there, Richard O'Connor?
I have to say, I've read one or two of Corelli Barnett's books about the war in North Africa. One of his books. There's also Arthur Bryant. I know these are very dated works, The Turning of the Tide, and I also I'm familiar. My first encounter with O'Connor was a book called Take These Men. And that's a book. Basically, it's an army equivalent of The Cruel Sea. It's an army equivalent of Nicholas Montserrat. It was written by an officer who was from Hong Kong. He was born in Hong Kong, sort of in the early part of the 20th century, and essentially ended up in the Royal Tank Regiment with the original Royal Tank Regiment battalions that were serving. I think he was actually with one Royal Tank Regiment, like the first one, deployed in North Africa at the beginning of the war, and they ended up in 7th Armoured. So this is a fictional account of a person's actual war service. And right from the very beginning, the campaigns under Wavell, where they basically confront and then eventually defeat the Italians. And essentially the way it's portrayed is basically, the armour that they have is not particularly brilliant. They've effectively, they've got a precursor. It's effectively a precursor to the Matilda tank, and then they're starting to upgrade. They get Crusaders as well, and they always know that they're one step ahead of the Italians. But then basically you have the introduction of the Germans, and their tanks are superior. Their armament isn't particularly brilliant, but the thing about it is they're faster and they're more robust. And they seem to be better at this particular form of warfare at a tactical level than the British and the Italians are. And they're able to, sort of pull off greater victories with better resources. They're also able to coordinate their Italian allies better. And the one thing that comes across very strongly is basically the effective use of anti-tank by the Germans, of anti-tank fire, particularly the introduction of the 88. The 88 anti-tank weapon basically on the battlefield is an absolute killer. And this is where O'Connor comes in. So O'Connor develops tactics, well, certainly what I remember reading, he develops tactics that essentially in some ways mimic the type of tactics that Rommel and some of his commanders are practicing, utilizing armor as well as anti-tank and creating little traps and funnels using a combination of, sort of basically mobile anti-tank sites, essentially armored units as well that are constantly on the move, as well as the effective use. Basically, there's minefields been laid all over the North African desert, and sometimes they're laid in advance of a campaign, and sometimes you're coming across them from a previous campaign, and they're on your maps. If you don't see them, basically you're going to run into trouble. And then there's also enemy minefields. So essentially what they're doing is they're trying to create sort of channels, essentially limit essentially what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that flanks can't be overextended. They're trying to set limits in order to establish lines. And what O'Connor is able to do is he's able to establish these boundaries in terms of, sort of how far either the enemy or the friendly flank goes. And he's able to exploit gaps in the line. So he's very good at that particular type of warfare. And he's probably among the British generals, he's certainly the best and the most inventive. But
I want to get a 41 because it's really epic. And I want to just show this picture. This is the ironically named Treaty of Eternal Peace between Hungary and Yugoslavia. So on the right is Laszlo Bardozi. He's the Hungarian foreign minister. And on the left is the Yugoslav foreign minister, Alexander Markovic. Now, the fate of these two guys rather different. The Yugoslav guy disappears. But the one on the right, Laszlo Bardozi, becomes, in due course, Prime Minister of Hungary. And he, after the war, is tried and sentenced for war crimes and is executed in Hungary. So anyway, as we know, any treaty of eternal peace is almost certainly never going to last. And this one didn't last very long at all. So let's look at 1941, Joe. I'll put that map up because as we see this week, so on the 7th of December, we had the Pearl Harbor attack. And this was the signal for the Japanese assault right across that area that you see there. So well, we can't see where Pearl Harbor is. It's, I think, over to the top right. But the operations that this triggered extended. Already China moved. It was the Japanese were in China. They occupied Shanghai, started to attack Hong Kong, which is in the Guangzhou on the map. They started to land in Malaysia, and what was now Malaysia, now British Malaya. Land in the Dutch East Indies, Jakarta, in that area, and also Guam. You can see that spot, Guam, and also Wake Island, which is obscured. It's right in the middle of the Pacific. All this was happening at the same time on the 8th and 9th of December 1941. Is there a more astonishing moment in any world war anywhere in history than this, the attempt by Japan in this extraordinary, epic campaign to try and knock America out of the war, take over and replace the British, French, and the Dutch as imperial suzerains in the area and create a new world order? It all went wrong. But is there a more extraordinary moment than this in history? I think the 7th of December was the most important moment in modern world history because it brought the Americans into the war and then everything that followed. But look what the Japanese were trying to do, Joe. I mean, it is astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I made this point last week in terms of the amount of territory captured, the amount of distance covered. I mean, this is a war that's waged in 2 oceans and multiple seas. I mean, you have, the South China Sea, you've got the Aratura Sea, you've got the Celebes Sea, and the Java Sea as well, where battle takes place. Sort of you've got a coalition that's basically assembled, and we'll be dealing with the anniversary of this, but a naval coalition is assembled involving about 4 or 5 different countries, including the United States, and they put together a flotilla or a fleet of cruisers and some battleships to take on the Japanese, and the Japanese absolutely wipe the floor with them. They basically sink almost every single one. So the Battle of the Java Sea is one of these great Japanese victories, and it's a surface fleet battle. So the Japanese proved themselves superior in terms of battleship to battleship warfare. But they're carrying out carrier warfare at this particular point, carriers in support of transports that are basically, they're equipped with landing craft. So one of the things that needs to be made very clear is that the Japanese, like the Americans, have developed amphibious capability. They are landing troops at various different islands and land masses all over this area. Basically below the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean area, essentially all these islands and land masses that lie between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, what we call euphemistically the Far East. And, you have advances in mainland Asia, which includes Malaysia and going all the way down into Singapore. And then eventually they go into Sumatra as well, and Indonesia, which is down known as Java. It's a Dutch colony, and they're essentially seizing multiple colonies at the same time. So there is lots of natural resources there. There's a particular reason why they need to take all of these and take them quickly. So they're attacking multiple European allies as well as the Americans. They're attacking the Americans, who have domination of the Philippines, or at least hegemony over the Philippines area. It's their sphere of influence. You have the Dutch sphere of influence as well. And some French as well. There's some French influence around here, particularly in Indochina. So they've already taken over large parts of Indochina. And then the British, basically, their sphere of influence is Malaysia, as well as Burma, and also Singapore. And the value of these colonies is in, you have a lot of raw materials, but particularly oil in Indonesia or Java, basically the Dutch control territory. And it's not for nothing that basically the Shell company is one of the most successful oil companies in the world at this particular point, in terms of being a global oil company, because there are oil-rich assets in Dutch colonies, both in the Caribbean, that's Curacao, and also Indonesia. So there's oil fields all over that area. And this is very important for the Japanese because they are running out of oil due to the American embargo. In Malaysia, you have something incredible like 75 to 80% of the world's rubber, possibly more, possibly as much as 90%, as well as tin and copper. Huge deposits of those resources there, and rubber obviously is a natural resource that it's grown. You've got rubber plantations there, and what's the value of rubber? You need it for insulation, you need it for tires, you need it for also this is a raw material that you need for the war. Like, I mean, you can't run trucks, and you know, one of the reasons the Second World War is won by the Allies is because they produce more trucks than their enemies. They're fully motorized, the British and the Americans, and they also help fully motorize the Soviet army as well. And the trucks that are basically run are largely American manufactured trucks, and essentially they need tires. Tires are important, so where do you get the rubber? Well, one of the places that's captured by the Japanese produces most of the world's rubber. And then also you have the Philippines as well, some natural resources there, but also in particular, it's strategically important. The Americans can use the Philippines to attack the Japanese advances, or basically turn back the Japanese advances in other parts of those far eastern colonies. So the Philippines is a very important objective. It's a very complicated objective because there's multiple land masses as well as islands. There's like probably something like 1,000 islands within that chain of land masses that basically we're looking at in terms of the Philippines. So they have to concentrate on the most important ones like Luzon, where you have Manila, and then Mindanao to the south. And then you have Palawan over towards the west. And then finally, it's very important in order to counteract the possibility of Allied forces coming from Australia and basically launching a counterattack, which they eventually did. It's very important that you try and take hold of essentially the Dutch possessions on the landmass that we call it New Guinea, but effectively only half of it, like Papua New Guinea, and only half that territory is essentially owned by the British Empire. And some of that was actually captured, like the Solomons and that territory. Some of it was captured from the German Empire. So it's very important that they capture as much of that territory as possible and they advance into it. And this is where they're going to meet their first reversal. Let's not forget the islands, though. You've got islands like Guam and Wake Island, which are American controlled, and it's easy for the Japanese to basically take these islands in the fact that the Japanese already they own quite a lot of the island chains in this part of the Pacific. So the Americans are surrounded, and particularly there's a battle that takes place at Wake Island throughout this particular period, throughout December going into early 42, where American Marines, it's primarily US Marines that are holding out on this island. There's a garrison of maybe, I think, 2,000 to 3,000 Marines and American contractors and other personnel that hold out on Wake Island. And they basically, the Japanese land at Wake Island, and it takes them about 3 to 5 days for them to fully conquer the island. But the Marines hold out, they basically hold out to the last round of ammunition before surrendering. And some American Marines are killed, but many are imprisoned, and there's a number that survived the war. And then also, as you pointed out, also there is essentially the appropriation of Thailand into the Axis side, and the Thai forces, their air forces and their army fight as allies of the Japanese throughout the Second World War, or at least up until 1944 at any rate. You're going to make a point about the Japanese advance in the Indochina Thailand region there, Eddie.
I mentioned Jitra because the Battle of Jitra begins, and if you can see the map, you can see British Malaya, that's what it illustrates, and the border with Thailand. So Thailand's the kingdom, it's invaded, it allied with the Japanese, and Jitra was basically on the main road, one of the roads that the Japanese had to use to advance into Malaya, and Jitra is where the battle began, and it ended pretty quickly. It was a disaster. It's one of the worst defeats for the British Imperial and colonial forces in the Second World War. They were, even though they probably outnumbered, or at least matched Japanese in numbers, they were completely, comprehensively defeated. 3 battalions were effectively liquidated, and a division was put out of action. But we'll come back to that and another date on what's happening there. I want to move to 1943 now. And this is just the Battle of San Pietro in Fine. And this photograph, I mean, it's not particularly helpful, I suppose, but it's taken from the south, looking towards San Pietro. San Pietro in Fine was on basically the Bernhardt line, and it needed to be taken. And it was mainly an American operation. And the reason why people are familiar with it is that a film of the Battle of San Pietro in Fine was made. Probably the first live action feature film ever made, and the man who made it is the guy on the left, and he's in his uniform. That is John Huston. So you can watch that, and it became quite a iconic film, and for his post-war career as well. And that picture is taken somewhere around San Pietro in Fine, around the time, and then they're looking for mines. It's a very tough battle for the Americans. Just the town was completely destroyed. Now we're moving on to the creation. This is Ira Eaker, who's put in charge of the Mediterranean Air Force. And there he is. He's having a chat with Air Marshal Tedder, who was, I'm not sure when this was taken, but Tedder was taken over to be the air commander for Overlord. And Ira Eaker comes in on the right. Tell us about Ira Eaker, Joe. Why does he matter?
Ira Eaker, just like a lot of American Air Force commanders at this particular point, he is like, I mean, you've got leading figures like Ira Eaker, Hap Arnold, and Jimmy Doolittle, who are pioneers basically of essentially American air warfare at this particular time, and particularly the doctrine that's been promoted by the Americans. So they're Ira Eaker is basically defending the doctrine of daylight bombing over Europe, using both the American the 15th Air Force in Mediterranean. Am I correct?
The 15th Air Force in the Med.
Yeah. In the Med, American 15th in the Med, and the 8th Air Force, American 8th Air Force, operating out of Britain, which is probably, am I going to, like, I mean, I know we love making grand statements on the show about, you know, it's the greatest, you know, sort of it's Trumpian type stuff, you know, we've never seen anything like this before. But I think I could wager that the 8th Air Force is possibly the largest Air Force ever assembled. It's not like, I mean, these air forces are not equal in terms of their strength, in terms of equipment, their disposition, the number of personnel that are serving with them. I mean, the air forces that are serving in the Pacific are considerably smaller than the ones in Europe. The 15th and 8th Air Force, in terms of their absolute size and the number of personnel serving within them, and also like including the 9th Air Force, you have you know, like, I mean, a 9th is tactical largely, but you have, you know, huge amounts of men and material and personnel basically just serving this machine that's operating out of these locations, effectively bombing, you know, effectively trying to orchestrate round-the-clock bombing of Nazi-occupied Europe, but in particular the Third Reich, Germany, basically, and the industrial centers there. The whole aim is basically it's to wage a strategic bombing war in daylight, with some support from the Royal Air Force, because the Royal Air Force are going to be operating their dehousing policy. But RAF Bomber Command, primarily based out of the United Kingdom, is going to basically dehouse the urban populations of Germany in support of basically gradually shutting down Germany's industrial capability. The purpose of the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force is to provide basically, you know, effectively the strategic dimension to the bombing campaign, was basically targeting these industrial zones, and their primary target is not munitions plants or even ball bearings plants, which are incredibly important to crippling Germany's war effort. No, they're going to consistently target oil facilities. They're going to target oil refineries like Ploesti. That's going to be a key target for Ira Eaker in command of 15th Air Force. He's going to be basically targeting Ploesti very strongly, and they're going to be hitting that facility consistently, because it's that facility provides Germany and the Axis forces with most of their oil, particularly after they lose the oil fields in Libya, after they lose the North African campaign. And eventually they do have oil sites in southern Poland and in different other areas that they managed to get their hands on, as well as Norway as well. But the fact of the matter is the main facility is in Romania, it's Ploiești. And in addition, also throughout Germany, you have oil refineries, and also you've got synthetic oil refining plants. So basically, these are plants that effectively convert coal, or basically charcoal, effectively mined resources, into sort of a liquefied kind of petroleum. So they're able to do that as well. And synthetic oil plants, as well as basically oil refineries and anything that involving fuel, American bomber crews have primary, secondary, and tertiary targets. They're given these lists every time they take off. The reason they have these lists of targets, basically, because if you fly over one site and the weather's bad and you've no visibility, you are diverted to a secondary target, which is very often an oil refinery or a synthetic oil plant. And then basically, if the weather's bad over that site, then you're diverted to the tertiary target, which could be a munitions plant or a ball bearing plant somewhere else, somewhere in the vicinity of where you were originally sent. And it's ECR that is largely responsible for setting up that strategic system of basically having your primary, secondary, and tertiary targets, so that they're getting maximum efficiency out of these American bomber wings that are sent on these missions over enemy territory in order to strategically strike these very important industrial sites and knock them out of action, which, you know, the German general staff admit in their interrogations of the Americans after the war. They admit that after 1943, they weren't really able to produce anything measurably anymore, and it was absolutely crippling and undermining the Wehrmacht's war effort, because they just couldn't get what they needed, because the bombers were just basically knocking it out. So it just goes to show there's a huge amount of sacrifice being made in 1943 because they don't have effective fighter escort for the bombers. The bombers have been decimated. They're taking, on average, 25% losses on most major operations that they're launching particularly over Germany. But Eicher is one of these Air Force commanders that basically is very much all in favor of staying the course. And even though his British opposite numbers, including Harris and Tedder, are incredibly critical of essentially American adherence to the strategy, rigid adherence to the strategy, and just saying, oh, come over with us, start bombing at night. It'll be less wasteful, it'll be cheaper, whatever like that. No, they stick to their guns, and it actually works, but very costly.
Yeah, Eicher's an interesting personality. He's a Texan. And so he was a supporter of the Democrat Party and a friend of Lyndon Johnson. So he supported Lyndon Johnson's run for Congress, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Overall, history is not kind to Lyndon Johnson. And his post-war career, he went into business, and very late in his life, he did a degree in journalism. He always wanted to be a journalist. So he's a kind of interesting guy. I think he was kind of liked, but I don't think any film has ever been made about him. And last slide, and I think this is a top entertaining the show, because I'm going to put a picture. So this month in 1944, Harold Alexander was made Field Marshal, which is the highest possible rank you can get in the British Army, certainly in any army. So I'm not sure where this photograph was taken, but the guy he's talking to with the shiny helmet is Lucien Truscott. I suspect that must be either in Sicily or in Italy. And Harold Alexander is made Field Marshal, Supreme Commander for the Allied forces in the Mediterranean. So Alexander, you couldn't have someone more different to Patton, could you, Joe? You couldn't have anybody more different to Patton than Harold Alexander, could you?
No, because one of the things I would have to say is that Harold Alexander was one of these figures who's kind of like Brooke. He was very level-headed, he was a calm operator. He had a very clear focus. Alexander, just to give a bit of background, Alexander was sent into the Dunkirk salient around the time that General Lord Gore was relieved of command because really Gord had done his job. He'd overseen the strategic withdrawal and the successful retreat of the bulk of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, to the coast of the northwestern France, or sorry, northeastern part of France, I should say, close to the Belgian frontier. And, obviously Calais had been captured because there had been a pincer move, so they're surrounded. But basically, he's gotten them to a port facility, and effectively he's, things are in bad order, but everything's tidied up. And Alexander is sent in the middle of basically Luftwaffe strafing attacks, Stuka dive bombing attacks, as well as high-level bombing attacks on Dunkirk, the surrounding area of the port, the surrounding fishing villages, and also the, the resort towns that basically are around Dunkirk, like Bray Dunes and places like that. Essentially, the British soldiers and RAF personnel and other personnel that are there are terrified. You do have a lieutenant commander, just trying to remember the Royal Navy commander that they've basically sent ashore, Will Tennant, or Bill Tennant, who basically identifies the mole around about the 27th of May 1940, and basically reckons we can use this here and get the men off. And Gord is not playing ball towards the end of his time as commander. He's effectively lost command of his army, but he's, sort of maintaining some level of command, and he's in touch with the French admiral. But basically, Tennant is finding Gord to be a little bit of a pain in the backside. So they get him out, put Harold Alexander in, and then Alexander works very well with Tennant and with the Navy to basically oversee, the remaining withdrawal of the BEF. And that's really how the BEF gets off. Alexander plays a very key role in that, and he goes around, sort of on a motor launch from one end of the beach to the other to make sure that there are no remaining British troops. So this is an example. This is an example of what I just wanted to say. Sorry, Eddie, you wanted to come in on this?
The compare and contrast pattern.
Compare and contrast. The point I'm trying to...
is a combat commander.
Yeah.
Harold Alexander is never seen as that, certainly in the Second World War. He's a staff officer, he's a planner, he's a diplomat, he's very well connected. He's another Irishman. So I think he was born in Ulster, born in Calais. Very distinguished family, and he was before the war. When a Harrow, but he was a king's equerry, so he was selected to be, to socialise with the king. So he came from a cut above, but he's best known, I think, as a staff officer. But
that's
I
right.
think Churchill liked him, didn't he? I think Churchill.
A lot of people did like him. I mean, Eisenhower got on relatively well with. I'm not entirely saying that they got on like a house on fire, but they got on relatively well. He was very good at dealing with the Americans, very good diplomat. That was the reason. The reason why I cited the Dunkirk example is because early on he displays his ability to work very well with other services. So as an inter-service commander, diplomat, basically he works extremely well. So he's very good at basically getting cooperative relationships right across the services with naval commanders and so on. And he's identified as somebody who will work very well in terms of dealing with relations with the Allies. But one of the things I would have to say is that when it came to Patton, Alexander did find him exasperating. And you know this because from the Sicilian campaign, Alexander gave Patton a clear order not to make an advance. He wanted to keep so you had the key commanders in the Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, were Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton. They were the key commanders. Bradley was effectively independent, but he was somewhat subordinate to Patton. And they're commanding their own particular, shall we say, army, maybe not armies, but like army groups, effectively moving in, sort of Monty on the coastline, on the eastern coast, and Patton and Bradley further inland. But they need to kind of discipline this advance. And one of the things that happens is that basically Patton breaks ranks and he goes straight for Patton, for Palermo. And he's given a direct order by Alexander, he's in overall control of this particular operation. He's not the overall commander, but he is effectively the key point person in terms of coordinating this very brand new coalition. This is the first time that they're going to go into Europe as coalition partners. And Alexander has a lot of trouble keeping control of Patton and making him do his job. And Patton is right at the exterior end, the western flank. And he's not playing ball at all. And they have to completely adapt their Sicilian strategy. It works out in the end. They conquered the island in just about a month or so. But the fact of the matter is that the contrast, if you're talking about contrasting temperaments, the temperament of Patton is basically he's hot-tempered, he's impetuous, he's very cocky and arrogant, and very
no evidence at all of Harold Alexander ever saying anything out of turn.
Yes, I mean, but one of the things I would say is at the outset, Alexander made a great effort to kind of try and placate Patton, but he also put across very strongly that we have to, we have to consider, sort of Montgomery's role in this operation and make sure that people get equal credit. And I think Alexander had a very difficult balancing act to get. He needed to placate the egos of both these men. These are two very egotistical individuals, and with completely different skill sets and completely different ways of relating to their own men, but their own particular unique talents. And he needs to get the best out of them, and I think he does it quite well. But I think it's not for nothing that that Patton ends up ultimately being transferred out of the Mediterranean theater, and basically, obviously, they need their best for the invasion of Northwest Europe. But it's not for nothing that Alexander and Patton part ways ultimately.
Exactly, and then in Northwest Europe, the Supreme Commander is Eisenhower. He's reporting to Eisenhower, doesn't report to a Brit. Alexander, the person who's very rude about Alexander, of course, is Mark Clark.
Yes,
who takes over the American army in Italy as commander of the Fifth Army. And you read diaries that were written either at the time by him or by the person he was dictated to, describe Alexander in the rudest possible terms. Really unpleasant, called him a feather duster and hopeless and useless. So Mark Clark. So I think in a way, Harold Alexander kind of symbolized to a certain type of American commander all the things they didn't like about Britain: a bit snobbish, a bit superior, understated, a cool character, always immaculately turned out, effortless superiority. In a way, I think it just kind of drove some of the Americans, Mark Clark included, up the wall.
Yeah, objectively, Alexander was so he was a staff officer. He wasn't he had some ability as an operational commander. This is one of the things.
He was a brigadier in the First World War, one of the youngest brigadiers in the British Army, or something like 24 or something.
Yes, exactly, and he's still a young man going into the Second World War as well. He's still relatively young compared to the remaining cadre of generals that are going in. But one of the things I would say is probably one of the reasons why the Americans, like Patton and then Mark Clark, are so critical of Alexander. One of the reasons why he's relegated to the Mediterranean theater, which, with all respect to your father and other veterans of the Italian campaign, after the opening of the campaign in Northwest Europe, it is basically, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a sideshow, because I don't agree it's a sideshow. It's a very important theater, but it's subordinate to the campaign in Northwest Europe. It's the subordinate objective. I think in its own way, it's got equal importance in terms of certain aspects. Even though the campaign in southern France was a very quick campaign and they basically were able to wrap up France I have a very low opinion of the commanders that were involved in the southern French campaign. I think they were of a far less caliber than the commanders that were involved in the Italian campaign. Well, I'm of that opinion. In many respects, they didn't face that much opposition, and
that's true.
And in terms of how they handled matters in the rear, it was particularly retaliatory attacks and whatever like that was dreadful. Also, they let the French run amok. One of the things I would say, not the French people, but the French military.
No, the French army. The French in 1945, the French got into Italy. It was under Jacob Egan, so they weren't going to leave.
Yes,
they're going to stay there.
Yeah, exactly. And they weren't very good at getting them to play ball in terms of.
No, that's true. But Alexander, after the war, of course, he became governor in Canada. His heir, who's there is he got an earldom, is
Yes.
heir, and that's Earl Alexander of Tunis. So he's
Yeah.
celebrated for his role in the north, in Tunisia, not
Yeah.
Italy. But you can see it in the dates. You can see 1941. I mean, it's the Eastern Front and it's Pacific. 1943 is the great peak of the drama in Italy. I think, the sequence of campaigns in the winter of 43, 44 up to Anzio, but then once you get into 44, it's Northwest Europe. But 45, as the European war has come to a climax, and then the Pacific War really becomes extraordinary. So there is a pattern to it all. So Alexander, I mean, he's a person. My father loved the guy. Never met him, of course. He remembers my dad driving into Tunis in May on the liberation of Tunis. The London Irish Rifles were the first marching troops into Tunis. And as they came in, they passed Harold Alexander, who became, after the war, his colonel-in-chief, I think, of the London Irish Rifles. And he was standing there looking immaculate in his sheepskin coat and his specially designed hat, which was inspired by Russian officers he worked with when he was involved in the Allied intervention after the First World War in Russia, with his immaculate boots. And I think for my dad, and I don't think he was unrepresentative, there was something about the immaculate coolness of Alexander that they liked. I think a lot of the ordinary British soldiers like their officers to look smart.
Yeah.
Don't look dirty, don't look scruffy. But at the same time, they didn't want them to look kind of silly. Which to an extent you might say about Patton, who had that specially designed helmet and, a pistol with the cowboy look. So it's in a way that the commanders have to reflect the spirit of their own men. I think for the Americans, ordinary American soldiers, they like the cowboy stuff that Patton manifested, the horse riding, the holsters, the look, the style, the shouting, the use of obscenities. Whereas I think the average British soldier, even though they all swore like troopers, and they like their commanders to be a bit posh and a bit posh.
I mean, it's totally playing to form. I mean, it's what they come to expect. I mean, I think Alexander also wore his role and responsibility very lightly. I think he was very much liked by his men, particularly his officers, but also by the ordinary soldiers. And he's very cool, calm, confident, under pressure. Probably, critiqued by the Americans has been very conservative. My favorite line, conservative in terms of advances and the broad front strategy. And I think they were just chomping at the bit. People like Clark and Patton were just anxious to get on and get things done. And Alexander was, I think correctly cautious so as not to, because Italy, you have to remember, Italy is a bleed out campaign. That's it. There's no particular point in trying to wrap up Italy quicker than they need to. Always remember Lee Windsor, the Canadian historian, who I would like to get on this show. He talks a lot about Canada's involvement, but he's a general expert on the Italian campaign. And he said, let's be clear, Italy is a bleed-out campaign. It's designed to divert resources. The longer it goes on, people think it's a sideshow, but it's not. It's designed to divert resources away from other fronts, particularly in Western Europe, particularly the Eastern Front. And they suck in quite a lot. And it's a headache for the Germans. They don't exactly have the most competent supreme commander in Italy and whatever. But the thing about it is, it's not when they point at Mark Clark pointing at the arrows basically after he takes Rome with the big smiley face and the great faux pas for all Allied commanders. Oh my God! Is he serious? Is he actually pointing towards this is our big opportunity to encircle and capture the remaining German forces and basically roll up the entire Italian campaign? It's not the point. The fact of the matter is, they're not interested in pouring endless amounts of resources, including manpower, into meat grinding campaigns within the Italian campaign. It's already costly enough as it is. And Alexander, particularly towards the end, I think, and he's getting into conflicts with Truscott as well, he's not particularly interested in sacrificing Allied forces, whether they be American or British, in grand gesture campaigns or whatever like that, because he knows how costly they are. He's seen how much, Patton lost a lot of his forces in trying to get to Messina before Monty did. A lot of men were killed in that didn't need to die. It's questionable whether it was necessary. This was just his competitive edge. I do like the line though from the movie, and this is basically happening in the movie Patton around the time of the Italian campaign when he's meeting with, basically the American press corps, and they're asking him. He's getting very popular and lots of commentary back in the United States, and so, "What about those pearl-handled revolvers, General?" And he just looks at them and he goes, "They're ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would wear pearl-handled revolvers." It's the best line, but it sums up. It's a very George C. Scott performance of a lifetime, and he also plays basically on this, this day where Patton breaks his neck. George C. Scott goes on to play Patton again in another movie, which is basically recounting this particular incident, basically the accident that he's involved in Germany, followed by his decline, and we'll be covering his death in a subsequent episode.
Yes, 21st of December. Anyway, look, that's another great show, Joe. I mean, George Patton deserves the attention that he gets, and I'd like to send best wishes to Helen, his granddaughter, who I've met. Very proud of her grandfather's role, particularly in Sicily, not just there, but I met her in Sicily, and it was a marvelous moment because she was on stage talking on the very 80 years to the day that her father got off the boat in Licata in Sicily. It was amazing. So that was really important, and I think Harold Alexander is the man again. And it's we like to have these compare and contrast moments. And of course, this week in 1941, it's this astonishing moment, isn't it, in the Pacific War? Your head almost explodes thinking, how on earth did anybody think this was possible? But someone did, and we can discuss how close they ever got to achieving their objectives. I think they always fell short, but it was a seminal moment in world history. Joe, thanks very much. And I'm just going to close the show now. So thanks very much, Joe. Great. Okay, well, that's it for this week. We will be back next week with another exploration of key dates in the Second World War, looking at the each year, looking at that particular week each year in the Second World War. I think it helps us develop some interesting insights. I hope you find it useful. Please say if you like it on YouTube, and we welcome your comments. So until next time, from me and everybody here at This Week in the Second World War, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.